Welcome back, everybody, to another edition, another episode of our Hazel's Flight School Beer Edition. I'm Josh Gosnell.
I'm Lily.
And today we are going to be looking into the world of malt. What is malt? How is it used? And how is it expressed through the beer and through the brewing processes? So, for starters, we have to define what is malt. Is this the stuff that they put in old school milkshakes to make it taste that much better? Partially, but not completely. When it comes to beer, malt is any sort of grain. We have anything from barley being the most common, the most widely used, to wheat, oats, rye, even corn can go into beer. Now, malt refers to more of a process that these grains go through. You start with, say, barley. You start with just the regular cereal grains. You think like your bread wheat. We start with that, and it goes through a process of germination, which essentially they water the grain just enough to trick it into thinking that it's growing. And in that process, it turns a lot of these starches into sugars, which the yeast will need to produce all that alcohol in the beer, all the bubbly, all the CO2 that we get into it. Once that germination process is halted, it goes into a kilning or a roasting process, to where they take it, stop that process completely, and keep all those good sugars within the grain. From there, we can get an array of different colors, different flavors, different textures, different products, depending on certain processes past that. And malt, when it comes to beer, is the basis for a lot of it. Well, within beer itself, it's what gives us, like I said, all that sugar that we need for fermentation. These yeasts will just start eating at that sugar, producing mostly CO2 and alcohol. Besides some other things. Besides that, it provides mouthfeel, that body. When somebody says a malty beer, sometimes they may confuse it with a heavy beer, which is not always, they aren't mutually exclusive groups. You can have a very malty beer, but have it be very light body, very easy drinking, as we'll see here shortly. So any questions about malts?
So since the malting process, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Produces sugar, does that automatically add sweetness to any malted beer?
Yes and no. That has to do a little bit more so with the yeast, as well as how much sugar is produced in here. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit as we go through each of the not undistinct styles, but as different malts, different types, showcase kind of what they're about. All right, so what we're going to be doing today is looking at 3 different styles to get just a general overview of how malt is expressed in beers. We're going to start with a Kolsch, going on to an amber, and eventually to a stout. So a Kolsch is a fun style. It's a little bit of a hybrid. Now, going on to the yeast side of things, what we really want to focus on is just the malt. First thing that you'll notice is the clarity of it. It's pale, golden in color, and that comes from the use of much paler malts. They don't roast as long. You can think of these malts in their kilning process as bread. You either have just plain out of the package bread, or you have a little bit toast and almost a burn as you go along the spectrum of the color of the malt. So for starters, we have this Kolsch here, and you don't get a ton of malty character typically on the nose on some of these. All right, so what do you get out of that paler malt character?
It reminded me a little bit of an IPA, to be honest.
Okay.
And I'm probably just thinking that because it's hazy.
Yeah.
And that's what I would associate with an IPA. But having told me that it is malted, I do notice that, but it's more of a background characteristic in this beer.
Yeah, you definitely get that crispness off of there, which is typical of a Kolsch. It's something light, clean, but you do get some of that crackery, like light, like picture very, very light, bready, or that lighter, paler, almost like I said, crackery sort of flavor to it. You just get something very light, even a little bit of butter, which can be an off flavor, but here it's acceptable in small amounts. But you get that like almost buttered cracker, just something very simple, very light, but you get just like that little bit of backbone to it. Now when we go into, say, an amber here, you also notice it's got a different sort of amber color to it. And that will be from part of the malting process or certain malts that they use within them called either caramel or crystal malts, or even going into Vienna or Munich, or a multitude of malts that will kind of fit that middle ground to where it's not burnt jet black, but it's also not still that pale golden color of almost unmalted barley. So at this one, you'll notice some different sort of flavors to it.
It smells completely different too.
And what are you smelling? What do you notice?
Fruitier.
What kind of fruit? Let's pick your brain a little.
Some raspberry. A little bit like some pomegranate elements as well.
And that could be partially because of the hops or the yeast that they do. They're a little bit more on the aromatic side of beer ingredients, so we could definitely be getting some of the hop character out of that. I do get a little bit of that floral, humulus sort of hop fruit to it. Then I also get this like light, nutty profile. Just very, very light. Like if you opened a bag of almonds across the room, you can just get this faint nutty character to it.
The nutty characteristics, like the almond you smelled, I definitely tasted that more than I smelled it.
Yeah, definitely a lot of the malty character comes through a little bit more on the palate, I feel. It's not as noticeable when you have a little bit of hops like this amber. You get that off the nose. It's just more floral, a little more vibrant than those subdued malty characters. But on the palate is where I feel you really get that malty character out. You can pick apart just this little light caramel drizzle in there, little nutty, and then just that kind of middle ground, like whole wheat bread or like whole grain bread to it. Just this hearty grain character to it.
Your Rudy's whole wheat.
Yes. From there, we move on to a stout, which is one of my favorite styles. I love it if you're a coffee drinker, like your dark chocolate, like some of those a little more bitter side of things, but also that richer sort of, like say, milkshake sometimes you get out of it. Maybe not all that sweetness, but just that richer character to it. So with this guy, obviously, it is pretty much jet black. Thin kind of caramel head on it. And then on the nose,
Definitely that coffee.
yeah,
That's such a strong note for me.
you get much more of those aggressive, dark characteristics. I even get some like very black licorice, or even licorice root, or you get clove. You get like that darker, leathery tobacco, or some notes that you can pull off of this. But you get that much kind of harsher, darker feel to it off the nose. Whereas in the last one, we had the hops kind of playing along with it a little bit. This one, you don't feel the hops nearly as much.
It smells so good.
Yeah. That's why it's one of my favorites. I love the stout style, just that richness, that assertive character to it. And then on the body, you get all of that roasty character out of it. You get that darker chocolate to me, maybe a little black pepper in there. Definitely that leather, like saddle sort of feel to it. And then a little bit of tobacco. Like if you were to walk into our humidor here at the store, you get a little bit of that to it. But what do you see out of it?
a huge punch of coffee.
Yeah,
That is
just
just
that.
so dominant. Dominant of a flavor for me.
Yeah, you get that
Yeah.
espresso, or even like one I love to use is like dark chocolate covered espresso beans.
Yeah.
That's one that I
perfect,
get.
Yeah.
Is you just get that little earthy sweetness from a chocolate while still having that bitterness, and then that coffee over the
Like
top.
a
or even
very, very bitter
espresso.
cacao.
Yeah, like a very, very dark chocolate to it. And with this comes kind of the roasting times with everything. You get, or a kilning time rather. You get a lighter malt, doesn't spend as much time to that hotter, that kilning process. Amber, somewhere in the middle. And then you get this darkness here from really spending some time in it.
Yeah. It's crazy that these 3 beers are so different, and yet they all share the main characteristic of being a malted beer. And
Yeah.
that puts
Yeah.
them into the same category, and yet they all are
In-
vastly different.
Yeah, into a certain, at a certain point, they all have malts. They're all kind of driven by a little bit maltier character, but they all present differently.
Yeah.
So when somebody says, I don't really like a malty beer, there is a broad range of malty or malt-driven beers that you can try. I know some people, stout can be a little bit too aggressive for them. You know, amber has just that nice middle ground, that nice nuttiness to it, a little bit softer in general, or just something pale, a good blonde, a good pale ale if you like a little bit of hoppy character to it. Will give you a little bit of that malty character, give you that soft roundness, that little lingering sweetness to it, but without being all those aggressive, really, really dark
Yeah.
roasted notes to it.
Yeah, I think when I first started trying more beers, I thought I would gravitate more towards the lighter beers, but I actually find stouts fairly approachable for me, and I think it's because I really like coffee.
Yeah.
And so that flavor profile translates easily for me, even though this seems more intimidating because it is such like a deep, rich color.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and that's exactly why I love it. Those aggressive flavors, and they can be a little bit more approachable if you know what your flavor preference is. You know, whether or not you like those darker chocolates, you like a little sweeter chocolate. Maybe something like a milk stout would be something for you. That little bit of sweetness on the back end will help balance that out a little bit. Or, you know, if you know you like your trail mix, your nutty character, a good amber or Belgian double may be something you're into. Like that lighter, a little more easy drinking, lighter bodied sort of feel to it. You know, a nice saison, a nice blonde, something in that realm of things will give you that malt character without being too over the top for you. Nice approachability throughout kind of that malt range.
Do these 3 beers have the same grain as their malt?
So grain and malt here. 2 little separations here. They will be using, in general, the same base malt. So that same 2-row pale malt will make up the body of most of these. It's the one that still has the most sugar to it. Whereas some of these darker malts, especially like something like the stout, they will use a combination of either some chocolate malts, some black patent being one of the big drivers, which doesn't impart a lot of sugar, but that color to it. They're using maybe 5% at best in this beer, but it gives all that color to it. Everything else, a lot of it will still be similar. Like I said, 2-row, that base pale malt, will be the body for most of these. Then you add some crystal, some caramel malts, some of those other like Munichs, Viennas, some of those middle range malts will add some flavor, a little bit of sugar to it, but not a ton. And you will get some of those flavors in it, but it won't make up the majority of the malt bill for these beers.
Are malts prepared separately from the beer and then added during the brewing process?
Yes, usually. So yeah, you'll have maltsters, like we have, I want to say seed stock here in Colorado. is a big maltster, or somebody who produces malts. You have those companies who will then ship to brewers. There are very few breweries out there that malt their own grains and then brew with them.
Okay.
But yeah, they'll usually be prepared off-site, shipped in pallets in big, like 100-pound bags to these breweries. They're then ground, get that surface area, you throw that into your water, steep that for a while, essentially making like a big malt porridge. From there, you pull that water off, and that's all your sugar water, that sweetness that you want, that'll be later converted into your alcohol and CO2 by the yeast.
Yeah. Does anybody drink just that?
So just the wort, you can't. I mean, it's perfectly fine to drink. It will just be sticky sweet, very bready. It'd be like eating bread dough. You kind of can do it.
That would be weird.
It's more of an experiment than just drinking wort.
Yeah.
So drinking that as a full-time beverage. It's fun to try, see what happens, but it's like you don't go out of your way to do that necessarily. All right, so that was a very quick trip through the world of malts and how that is shown through our different beers, through the different flavor profiles. You can find all of these available here in store at Hazel's Beverage World. We want to thank you guys for coming out, for taking this flight with us. Again, I'm Josh. I would like to give a big shout out to our help, Dylan Schwab with Crooked Stave Artisans.
Thanks for flying with us today. Subscribe to our channel, Hazel's Beverage World, on YouTube, and ask your questions in the comments.